Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. This is the Darklight Emissary, and today's video is going to cover 20 random lore questions from someone very new to Warhammer. I figured for those of you new to it, and even not so new, I could give some context to some of these questions. I went through them and they were all pretty good questions. This comes from the 40k subreddit from 4 years ago from a guy named Withered_King1. And so there's a big Reddit thread if you want to read it about other people's opinions on some of these answers. I'm sure some of mine will align with theirs. I did not read them. I just want to give my take on several lore questions because I figured some of them are worth the discussion. So as always, if you're new to this channel, I welcome you. Have fun listening to some lore bits while you're doing whatever you're doing. If you're not so new, you know how I feel about you. Thank you for being here and for supporting the channel. Whether you did a subscription yesterday or several years ago at this point, I appreciate the heck out of you, and you encourage me to keep going. But regardless, if you spend any time here at all, I appreciate it, and I appreciate being able to discuss the lore of this universe with those of you learning about it and those of you who want just more knowledge on the universe and somewhat of an ability to discuss it with someone else, even if it's a one-sided discussion as of right now. So without further ado, let's just dive straight into the questions here. So the first one we have is, which lore on the Emperor of Man is correct? Was he born from shaman souls or was he a space entity? I have no clue. So even after the Horus Heresy timeline that just ended, with the novelization of that timeline, I should say, over the last 20 years, the Emperor's true origins were never solidly given to us. We have had more clarification given from people around him that kind of confine him a bit more as an entity, as a person. He definitely seems for sure human and not something else masquerading as human. There were some speculations about him being a possible old one or something like that in the past. I remember that. If we're going to go by the most recent knowledge we were given, it comes from the book Master of Mankind, where the Emperor gives a vision to one of his Adeptus Custodes of him killing his uncle in retaliation for his uncle killing his father, I believe, if I'm remembering correctly. And that shows him as originating near Turkey, and he was an ancient Neolithic era human there, born thousands of years earlier, tens of thousands of years earlier, like 6,000 BC, or something like that. So he is just an incredibly old human. The theory of him being the shaman souls was kind of left on the wayside, I feel like, in the novelization for the era he was most active in, which is the Horus Heresy era. So it's possible that the shaman thing is correct and that they sacrificed their souls and created the Emperor as a single man, and that's what multiplied his psychic powers. But ultimately, his true origins are still somewhat of a mystery. You have to trust that the Emperor is giving the Custodi a true vision of his past and not a symbolic vision of his past. And at least me personally, I think that he gave the Custodi a true vision because, the Custodies he can trust completely. They're built from literally the ground up to trust only him and be loyal only to him. They can't even be corrupted by chaos, or if they can be, it would take so long for chaos to do it, they rather just kill them. So I don't see any reason for the Emperor to be deceptive on his origins to the Custodes. And since no one else was privy to those discussions and we're just looking at it through the fourth wall, I lend credence to that. But ultimately, we do not have a solid "this is simply it" as the answer for this one. The next one is, how big is the Warhammer 40k universe? So for this one, the 40k universe is pretty much just the Milky Way galaxy. There's very little information on anything extragalactic. We do not know of any other active galaxies with species from them. The closest we get to that is the Tyranids, which are an extragalactic invasion of aliens, but we do not know where the Tyranids originally came from. There is speculation that they came from another galaxy or that they've devoured many galaxies beforehand, that the entire galaxy is just Tyranids. The entire universe, I should say, is just Tyranids out around the Milky Way at least. But the only thing we really know about the Tyranids is, at minimum, they were dormant and sleeping in the galactic void between galaxies before being woken up by the Pharos machine blast during the Horus Heresy. that seemingly woke up the Tyranid swarms to start making their way for the next 10,000 years towards the Milky Way and then start invading it in the 41st millennium. We don't know if the warp extends to other galaxies. I think there is some suggestion by some of the forces of chaos that they do visit other galaxies and have roots in the warp expanding and connecting to other places that might fuel the warp, but we don't know for sure. Like, one of the things that I think that was said in one of the recent Dark Imperium books was some Nurgle demons being narrated as being able to travel to different dimensions, and that they are fighting wars and have influence in different dimensional places, but that doesn't necessarily extend to galaxies within the same universe as 40k. And so really the entire 40k universe just centralizes on the Milky Way galaxy and happenings within it, and then, you know, just any world within the Milky Way can be a place for there to be a story. And a lot of the stories do center around Terra, Mars, you know, like fairly common places. Cadia was a big place before it got destroyed in the latest Black Crusade in Abaddon. But then, like, sometimes novels take place in random areas, random parts of space. It helps make the universe feel a bit bigger when there's just random locations that we see once and never again, versus like seeing the same 3 locations in every single book or something. That always turns me off from something when everything takes place in one place. Don't like it. And that's part of why I've loved 40k for so long. Chances are if I open up a book, I'm going to visit a place I've not seen before. And often that environment, as it's described, is fairly different from the one I read previously. Imperial cities and things like that tend to kind of follow certain standards and design looks, although sometimes even those are different depending on the ruling government and how influenced by standard imperial propaganda they are. That varies a bit, and there's a question that kind of asks about that later on that we'll get into. All right, the next question we have is there any corner of the universe that is untouched by any of the factions? I mean, within the Milky Way, there certainly are places that might be completely untouched by any of the factions, like very isolated areas, but we wouldn't know what those are, since pretty much every book is detailed from the point of view of one of the existing factions. By that sheer perspective that we have a lens into this galaxy with, that means that that place is aware, you know, like it's being seen by one of the factions. So if there is a place that is untouched by any of the factions, we wouldn't have a book on it. Or if we did, it would be like, you know, just the narrator, just the author saying, no one knows about this place, and that would be where it's left at. And I don't really remember anything really being described as such like that. So I would say yes, these sorts of places exist, and they always will, because, you know, we're never going to have a story that literally corners every single place in the galaxy. That would be an impossibility and sheer speculation on the author's part to say, yeah, we've explored every cranny we can. That's part of what makes 40k fun, is they can kind of just keep going for as long as they want with it. All right, number 5. Are there independent human worlds that don't align with the Imperium? There is some, but most of them are on the fringes of space. Like, one of the videos that has done well on the channel is about, you know, what lives in the Halo stars or what lives in the Ghoul stars. Those videos kind of dive into this a bit. Those fringe areas do probably have human empires and or worlds that are not aligned with the Imperium. They're just too far away. Sometimes the Imperium becomes aware of them and tries to send a conversion fleet, you know, to go make them comply and join the Imperium, but often it's just the Imperium's too dragged down by its current wars and trying to retain territory and quash rebellions than it is about trying to expand to new territories or find new places to conquer. If the opportunity is easy enough and you know, enough leadership has the resources and becomes aware of such a place, certainly you know, like, there's a chance that the Imperium's going to take it down and try to bring it into the Imperium, but Usually these places would be on the edges of the galaxy in those fringe places. The Great Crusade went on for, I think, several hundred years, just off the top of my head. And so, like, the Primarchs and the Imperial Legions, the Space Marine Legions, the Imperial Army, they were in many different expeditionary fleets. The Legions were not just like the entire Legion in one expeditionary fleet. Often the Legions would split up into several expeditionary fleets with Imperial Auxiliaries, Titan Legions. There was a multifaceted assault usually, and they spread across the entire galaxy and conquered a large part of it, and those holdings stayed true even after the Horus Heresy. Some worlds were lost during the Horus Heresy in that conquering due to just the viciousness of that war, but then the rest were recomplied back to the Imperium or destroyed after the Great Crusade and after the Horus Heresy ended. And then the modern 40k Imperium still retains most of those worlds. And then over time, more worlds have been destroyed due to war, due to chaos, corruption, and any other number of calamities that befall said worlds. And then follow-up question that they ask here, if there does exist independent human worlds, how long do they usually stay neutral before the Imperium bursts through the door? Any that have been able to push back. So, this is like, there's no set time for how they can stay neutral. Like, if a scouting force of Imperial ships found an independent world, they'd probably mark it down in a logbook. Like, let's say a rogue trader found it, and rogue traders are chartered by the Imperium to do what they do. And rogue traders are kind of the scouts for the Imperium in a large sense. So let's say a rogue trader finds a world, and they're loyal to the Imperium, to the Emperor's vision of a united humanity, so they mark it down in a logbook and carry on their way, because rogue traders are also interested in treasure and trying to find valuable things to trade and, build their wealth. So they might keep it in their logbook for a long time. And imagine it's, a decade before they get back to a port of call that is, truly Imperium based, and, they report from their logbook that there's this world out there with humans on it, but they don't seem to know anything about the Imperium. That then has to filter through the bureaucracy of the Imperium to get to whoever in the Imperium would then be able to have enough influence and power to set up a fleet to go conquer that world in the name of the Imperium. That does happen, but I would guess, because the Imperium is such a slow, inefficient beast of a machine, that it would take anywhere between 50 years to centuries before some sort of fleet showed up to try to conquer that planet from the time of discovery. And whether or not they'd be able to push back is totally dependent on the technological level of that world. I would say most worlds probably do not have the tech available to fight the rest of the Imperium. Most of them are not going to have anything close to like Dark Age of technology level. That would be the only type of world I think that would be able to use their technology as a force multiplier to defeat the numbers of the Imperium with their more decrepit technology. But anything else is going to maybe be able to put up a fight, but for how long is going to be determined on their technological level and how many of their own soldiers they have, how well trained they are, all those different things. But chances are most worlds that they would be going up against are not going to have Titan Legions. They're not going to have anything of that sort unless I guess they run into a rogue Forge world. Then they might have to fight Titan Legions, which changes the game up a bit. But a lot of these worlds may not have their own fleets of ships, or if they do, they might be outdated fleets of ships that are smaller, like system patrollers, not ships of the line battleships like the Imperium has. The thing about the Imperium is that it's not the most efficient empire, and it's not the most high-tech anymore, but it makes up for it in sheer determination and the amount of soldiers it can throw at something if something becomes interesting enough for the Imperium to pay attention to. And that's the key indicator, pay attention to. Like, for example, the Tau Empire. If the Imperium wanted to wipe out the Tau and focus on that, they could. It's just not worth their time to, really. It would just take too many resources. They got to focus on Chaos and the Tyranids and the Necrons. Everything else matters way more than the Tau. Likewise, like if a local Space Marine chapter and became aware of an independent world and, saw that they were independent, they might log it down. But let's say they're fighting a Chaos Incursion too, like in the course of discovering that. they're going to prioritize that, and then that campaign could last a century, you know? So really, it's a gray area for this. Like, it really, really depends on the variables of that independent world to fight back against the Imperium. Next, we have 5.2, which is another follow-up with these worlds. What about semi-autonomous worlds? Now, I would say most worlds within the Imperium are ran this way. Most Imperial worlds are not absolutist, like Emperor worshippers. Most worlds have the opportunity to basically pay tithes to the Imperium, and then they gain their protection. They have the opportunity to basically give up some of their men as soldiers for planetary defense, and when the Imperial Army needs to muster Imperial Guard forces to, fight off some incursion by chaos or aliens or something. Basically, as long as they're willing to do those things, most worlds are left to their own devices, and the Imperium doesn't look much closer than that. Like, local religions even usually can basically say, hey, the Emperor is our deity, actually. Even though we've been worshiping this thing for thousands of years before we even heard of you or heard of the Emperor, totally it's the Emperor. And the Imperium is not going to look closer than that as long as the tithes keep coming in and the resources keep coming in that they requisition from a world within the Imperium. So within the Imperium and its million plus or however many worlds exist, all kinds of governments are going to exist. You're going to have democracies, oligarchies, probably communal, communist type governments. You're probably going to have weird mixes of government that we haven't seen before. Every world is going to have a governor that reports to the Imperium. That's their title and role, but they're probably like a local king or ruler or president or something. And each world is going to be different. And the Imperium might have some presence on that world in the form of like the official church and things like that sometimes, but there's just so many worlds that the Imperium can't really micromanage all of that. So they are going to let most worlds kind of do what they want. And that's why you'll see, if you ever look at like Imperial Guard armies, a lot of them kind of end up with their own kind of cultural differences. They dress differently. They might have different ways they talk and things like that, because the Imperium does not stamp out completely differing cultures. That doesn't exactly matter to them. What matters is that they comply to the machine at its base level, which is give us resources, pay lip service to the Emperor. If you try to rebel, we're going to come knocking, but otherwise, if you're doing your basic duties, they're not going to pay much attention to you. And then real quick, while I remember it, going back up to 5.1 here with, has there been any able to push back against the Imperium? For a time, there's been some rebellions that lasted a while. Like, you have probably one of the more infamous ones is the Badab Wars, where the world of Badab being ruled by by a chapter master, by a chapter of Space Marines called the Astral Claws. They ruled over that sector essentially, and then due to a number of disagreements with Imperial leadership over what they were doing, they ended up in a civil war against the Imperium. Several chapters fell in with the Astral Claws versus the Imperium, who brought in their own troops, and they had a pretty big knockout, drag-out fight. And the Astral Claws did turn into the Red Corsairs, which is kind of a renegade, pirate, chaos-aligned faction now. And they still kind of rule some of their own space, but not the Badab area. They moved off to the Maelstrom, which is like a localized warp storm, kind of like the Eye of Terror, but smaller, and they run their own space station there, and some things there. But that war lasted for a total of about 11 to 12 years. So, that's a pretty long time to hold out against the Imperial forces, but, that's with the Imperium constantly reinforcing and the opposing forces slowly losing more and more of their troops without getting as many supplies from what I remember of that war and why they eventually lost. The Imperium can keep calling on more and more chapters of Space Marines, Imperial Guard forces, fleets of ships, and the Badab rebels were well equipped to start with and had some pretty smart leadership in the form of the leader of the Astral Claws, but ultimately fell to the attrition of that fight. Alright, so moving on. What is education like for Imperial citizens? Now, this is going to highly depend on your place within Imperial society and what your chosen role is from the time you're born, because really who you're born to is going to kind of inform where you go, except in extreme cases. So, for example, if you are born to a chapter of Space Marines serfdom class, so Space Marines have serfs that are, indentured to the chapter permanently, and they basically usually are allowed to marry and have children that then take the place of their parents. And this has been going on since the legions 10,000 years earlier. So it's a long tradition. Many generations have been raised, lived, and died just serving, a specific Space Marine or a company of Space Marines in whatever roles they're needed. So, if one of them is specialized in being a pilot of a Thunderhawk, then that's what their son will do, or their daughter. If one of them is an artificer, helping to repair armor for a Space Marine, their son or daughter is likely going to do that as well. I imagine, depending on the chapter, some of them treat their serfs better than others, and I imagine if their aptitude shows for something different, that the chapter might reassign them to do something different if they need to, but I think they rely mostly on their parents teaching their son or daughter the trade of that they've been doing for often decades at the point that, they have a son or daughter, and then by the time they pass away, their children are ready to take up that mantle themselves. And this is the case for most positions within the Imperium at large. Like if your parents are Imperial Army, chances are you're going to be born and raised in the Imperial Army, and you're probably going to end up in their unit eventually once you come of age. Now, depending on the faction and the place, some places do recruit just from like noble families and from like aristocratic type locales. So like, for example, commissar schools that train up commissars will usually recruit children from places that are providing like just good genetic and sure knowledge, like a certain level of intelligence is going to be almost guaranteed that they can use to train them up into that position. I believe that Commissar Gaunt in the Gaunt's Ghost novels, I believe that he was maybe an orphan though, and brought to one of the skull areas for commissars to be educated there. But I don't believe that he had parents that sent him there. So sometimes orphaned children, if their aptitude is good enough, will be assigned, to become some kind of leadership role within the Imperium, and that's kind of how it's determined. But often it's usually determined by how you were born, with the exceptions being like, I guess, okay, here's a radical differences though. Like, for example, like imagine you're an Inquisitor and you find someone that you think would be a good Inquisitor. They could recruit you to join their retinue, and then over time have you apply to become an Interrogator, which is like, second in line next to Inquisitors. And then they basically make you their apprentice, and eventually you can graduate to become an Inquisitor. But you have to show potential for that first. And so Inquisitors are one of the few roles that are all-powerful in the Imperium, and they are handpicked based upon individual merits. You don't just get an inquisitorial role from birth. I imagine there are some cases of that, but usually the child is being educated by the parent to be in that role later on. It's not like they are just given it due to some kind of nepotism because of how powerful that role is. It's one of the roles that I would say does not fall to the corruption that the rest of the Imperium does, where often nepotism in like the noble classes would get someone in a position of power that shouldn't be there. It could probably still exist, but I can't think of a time where an Inquisitor is that incompetent that it seems like they were just raised up by virtue of who their parents were, or they somehow got some sign off to be an Inquisitor for like paying someone off. I don't think the Inquisition would really allow for that. They're one of the few organizations that has its own internal corruption issues as far as pecking order and power struggles, but to become one of them, that's not you can't pay an Inquisitor to become one of them. No one within the Inquisition would allow you to. And so, so education really depends on where you're born and who your parents are, I would say. where you're going to get that from. All right, next we have, do our in real life crops still exist, like corn, potatoes, etc.? I think in some forms they do. I can't think of times where they really bring up any of these, like, specifically. Most of the time eating is not really brought up a lot in the books, because a lot of books are battle books, and like it's really just talked about like ration packs and things like that. Like the contents of them is not exactly brought up. And I mean, the Imperium is heavily industrialized and has to churn out a lot of food for its soldiers, and so I think a lot of it gets just industrialized to the point where it's just kind of featureless bricks of nutrients, essentially, just to keep people going. I can't really think of any real food. Like, there's different alcohols sometimes mentioned and drug types mentioned, but really, as far as like vegetable crops and things like that, like there's entire agro worlds that do make a ton of different crops for consumption by the Imperium, but the exact specifics of those farms isn't usually brought up, and so it's hard to say exactly which of these may still exist and how they might be modified by this point to, I guess, be even easier to harvest. All right, the next one is, are there citizens who live off the grid? Sort of. Yes, there are ones that can do this, but it really depends on the world. Like, if a world is more of a forest type world, then you're going to have a bigger chance of being able to just kind of disappear into the forest if you want to. Often those forests are full of things that want to murder you, though, so, I mean, you usually have to be something that is equally dangerous to do that. And an example of that, to some degree, is in the latest book, Son of the Lion, with Lionel Johnson, Primarch of the Dark Angels, coming back. One thing that he is doing is he's trying to find some of his former Space Marine sons that were scattered to the far future during the Horus Heresy. And he does send one of his sons to go find a specific member, and this Space Marine is living like alone, isolated in a hut up on a mountain. And he basically just farms a little bit for himself and doesn't wear the armor of Space Marines anymore. And so, unless someone is getting close to him and looking closely, they might not even know he was once a Space Marine. And so, he's been living there without really being noticed for a long time, until basically the events of that book. So, you've got probably some people like him living off the grid, former, like leadership in the Imperial Army and things like that have retired and just want to kind of live out their retirement somewhere quiet. Those kind of worlds exist. Some of the aristocratic types live on like garden type worlds that are nobility only type of clubs, essentially, and they live on their estates far away from anybody. But some of them don't want to go there, and they'll just go to a random world, never to be heard or seen from again, because the Imperium ultimately is a big place, and there are many worlds that have not been explored super well, and the populations there are relatively small for the world. And so, except for a few like industrial points or maybe some hive cities like on the surface, the rest of the world might be barren or ruins or forest. It could be a myriad of things, and so you could potentially disappear depending on what your position is and how missed you would be or not. Okay, next we have, are there scavengers who scavenge from post-battle battlefields? This is going to depend on the battle and where it takes place. Sometimes I would imagine yes, that there would be scavengers. It would really depend on where it's happening, how intact a city is afterwards for there to be scavengers. But I would imagine this does happen. It just depends on where it does. Like, for example, orcs, after a fight, are definitely going to scavenge a battlefield. Like, that's how they get looted lemon rust tanks that they ride into battle with a bunch of, orc iconography all over it. They obviously are scavenging that from the Imperium. And so you have that sort of scavenging going on from orcs, and I imagine different, I imagine human underground elements will try to scavenge and, take weapons and stuff off a battlefield if it's left abandoned and there's not Space Marines there, or elements of the Imperial Army there, or Chaos Forces, whatever they're fighting. Like, The thing is, the Imperium is often fighting wars and battles that are so cataclysmic that there's not much there to scavenge afterwards. Literally objects to scavenge or people to do the scavenging. So it's going to highly be variable based upon how crazy that battle is and who is conducting that fight and how thorough they are at securing the battlefield after. And that's going to be highly dependent on the, either Imperial Army, Space Marine faction it all just kind of depends. Next is there a faction that could technologically rival the Imperium? I mean, most xenospecies rival the Imperium or eclipse it in terms of technology. They just normally don't have the numbers to challenge the Imperium directly in a contest of true martial prowess. Like the Eldar, they certainly outclass humanity on technological levels. The Drukhari, the Dark Eldar, if they ever got united under just one flag and woke up from their decadence, they would be a very scary force to fight. I mean, the Dark Eldar have captured suns that they use to power stuff in their dimension of Kamarog. They will conduct plots where they drop a suitcase with a mini black hole on a rival to assassinate them. They play with and have some really ancient and powerful technology that they somewhat know how to produce still. The Eldari have not lost their knowledge for some of that technology, especially on the Drukhari side of things. And so they eclipse the Imperium. Necrons certainly do. The Tau on some levels do. Most factions outclass the Imperium as far as technology. The Imperium has vestiges of the pinnacle of their technology from the Dark Age, but it's very few and far between. Most of their stuff is older and not in the best repair. The best thing the Imperium has is a vicious fighting spirit and grit and the numbers to throw their weight around with, essentially. All right, next we have, does anyone invent new technologies in 40k? The Tau Empire does. They're the youngest, advanced alien species that we know of in 40k, and they are the innovators. They're the ones who basically try to discover newer and more advanced ways to create exosuits and other technologies that they specialize in for their specific energy weapons and all that kind of stuff. So I'd say the Tau invent new technologies. There are some Mechanicus members who are senior adepts who do have the ability and basically the prestige to kind of dabble past the simply rote and ritualistic. That doesn't mean they aren't still called heretics by the more traditional dogmatic members of the Adeptus Mechanicus, but members like Belisarius Call are definitely still trying to do some innovations, and they kind of try to work their way around that system in place in the Imperium that stops a lot of reinvention or adaptability that humanity kind of was known for in the past. And so that kind of answers both of your questions. Usually it's been senior adepts of the Mechanicus. Fabius Bile was also someone like that, apothecary of the Emperor's Children Legion originally, and now he's kind of his own entity, and to this day he still just kind of does kind of crazy radical science experiments to try to create basically an evolved human form. He believes in the exaltation of humanity through science. He's kind of the last follower of the Emperor's imperial truth, so ironically he sort of is loyal to the old version of the Emperor in ways, although he doesn't probably see it as that. So beyond those individuals, everyone else either doesn't have the knowledge to even try to invent or innovate, or the oppression is so strong that if they tried, they would be destroyed by the system itself, essentially. But then you've got the really advanced species like the Drukhari and Eldari. They don't really have any need to invent new things. They just basically have top-tier tech that they can research and call upon when needed. But as far as the Craft World Eldar go, they don't have a lot of numbers to be just innovating anything new. And the Drukhari have the homunculi and others associated with those covens that probably do innovate and create new things, but they're often just new ways to torture. So they have the capability of doing far more than that. but they just kind of revel in their hedonistic pursuits. And they're basically, the homunculi are interested more in how to turn you into a football-sized sheet of skin that still screams, instead of try to, create a black hole gun that shoots a black hole for destructive purposes, because the Drukhari don't really go to war. They just raid. If they ever did go to war, like I said earlier, they would be trouble, but that's assuming they ever united together. I mean, I would assume that the orcs would have an easier time uniting as a species than the Drukhari would. That's how chaotic Drukhari society can be. With innovators of Imperial technology specifically, you basically got almost rediscoveries of previous tech from like the Dark Age, more so than any wholesale new inventions. It's more about rediscovering the past than anything brand new, usually. All right, so then he has a grouping of next questions for the Imperial Army. So, question 11 says, I know they got their pew-pew guns that barely hurt orcs, but are there any weapons the Imperial Army has that resemble artillery, anti-air, or anti-tank weapons? I haven't found much on this. I mean, this guy was new when he asked this. This was years ago that he asked this. I don't know how he could look up anything with the Imperial Guard or the Astra Militarum as they are now and not find anything resembling artillery, especially, or anti-tank. I mean, the Imperial Army, they're known for their artillery. They have the basilisks as artillery. They have bigger artillery pieces than that are a bit more uncommon, but they still have them. Tank-wise, they have the Bane Blade, which is just one of the biggest tanks they build. And it's definitely a monster when it comes to destroying other tanks. They've got the Venerable Lemon Russ tank, and many more aside from that. I mean, the Imperial Army, the Imperial Guard, a lot of their strength lies in their ability to have armored columns that do a lot of pushing the line, so to speak. Like, they might be known for their infantry and pure attrition there, but the true bulwark, I would say, of the Imperial Army is having those anti-hardened positioned forces available to them as well. And then, so jumping in from that, on number 12 here, does the Imperial Army soldier have a chance to ever become a Space Marine, or do the good ones still die as fast as the others? So Space Marines are not created from adults. Now, in the Horus Heresy era, there was a couple of instances of several Marines being created from adult companions of the Primarchs, but that was very uncommon, and the process often was half effective. It gave them longevity and some of the strength of a Space Marine, but it didn't usually work perfectly. But that was a boon the Emperor usually gave to his sons as a way to win over their loyalty more, was to allow for their closest confidants to basically not die of old age. Often when the Emperor showed up, the advisors to the Primarch were either older, or if they were younger, they would become older, of course, since they were mortal. And so most of them were given the option to elevate into a Space Marine, or as close to it as possible. The one that was not really ever a Space Marine, for example, is Corphaeron of the Wordbearers Legion. He was first captain of that legion, but he was never a Space Marine, and the other Wordbearers kind of resented him for that. They were like, he's not a true Space Marine, why is he leading us? He just sucks up to the Primarch, that sort of argument they kind of kept. And so one of the reasons why is just that the organs, the gene seed that's implanted in to turn the body of someone into a Space Marine works best with a adolescent male body. That's just what it was templated off of. And so anything more mature than that just doesn't accept the radical changes to the body that process forces upon the body. And so, as good as any soldier could be in the Imperium, they're just not going to be looked at as a candidate, because it's just likely going to fail to try to elevate them. And then the next part of this question, do the good ones still die as fast as the others? I mean, so it's a misnomer. There's a book out there that basically made everyone think that most Imperial Guardsmen die in 15 hours or less on battlefields across the Imperium, when it was talking about a very specific war and battle against orcs in a specific city on a specific planet. That was where you had a 15-hour average to live as a regular soldier there. It really depends on the guard unit and their speciality. For example, one of the most famous examples that I have given before is the Tanith First and Only Regiment. They are essentially a specialized force of scouts and special forces types. So they have lived through many campaigns and basically carved a niche for themselves to go, do the behind enemy line stuff and blow things up and cause problems with supply lines, things like that for enemies. They have many soldiers that have lived for, a decade plus or longer, even longer than that, conducting warfare on many different worlds and doing that effectively. So it's not the case that they just die that fast. Not every soldier is that expendable or that incompetent or that fresh and, a failure, I guess. There's plenty of Imperial Guard who basically are, just as good as Space Marines in their field. Like, not like on an individual level, I mean as a collective whole. Like, several of the scouts that the Tanith have defeated, like a Space Marine Dreadnought, have fooled Space Marines in mock battles, like Loyalists that they were going up against and kind of challenges against each other. They were able to fool Space Marines and, basically kill them in the mock games they played. So it really depends on the troop and what their specialization is. Push comes to shove, most of the regiments in the Imperium are some level of competent, because otherwise the Imperium itself would have probably fallen apart more so than it had already if every single guard unit was just dying that rapidly and had no staying power whatsoever. Alright, next is, has any group of Imperial soldiers ever gone on a mutiny against their commanding officer? Certainly this has happened. You're talking about untold trillions of troops across the galaxy. Certainly there's going to be cases of mutinies against their commanding officers, and these soldiers often will then flee and probably become pirates and raiders and, try their best to live on their own. They will sometimes just go join Chaos and become Chaos guardsmen, essentially, part of Chaos soldier forces. Like, for example, the Tanith, one of their main rivals are the Blood Pact, which are like professional soldiers on the Chaos side. They are not really too much different. They just fight for the Chaos forces in the area. They don't necessarily even dabble much in Chaos magic or do anything different from regular soldiers, but they are very competent troops, and some of them are former guardsmen that joined them. So some of them probably did mutiny against their commander, and the only way they were getting out of that execution was to join the enemy, essentially. And so that kind of goes to the result that is being asked in 13.1. It ranges from getting executed by the local commissar, arrested and put on trial and then executed if the time permits, or they end up breaking off and going and forming their own stuff. Again, with the Tanith, as an example, the Tanith had a main officer in that regiment that was plotting constantly to try to kill their commander, Commissar Gaunt, and he was pretty loud about it. He would just be like, you better watch your back, I'm coming for you, type of thing. Gaunt knew he was a good soldier, though, and kept him in leadership, and eventually that man, through a series of events, becomes very loyal to Gaunt. So, he never actually committed any actual mutiny against Gaunt, or things would have been different, but still, it really depends on the regiment, level of infraction, and if they actually carry out a mutiny and how successful it is, essentially. And then number 14 here is, can an Imperial soldier ever leave the army? I do imagine if they're old enough, they can retire. I don't know too many that do retire, but because a lot do die during battle. But essentially the officers, at least, I would imagine the officer class, a lot of them can retire. Enlisted might be a lifetime commitment, and again, an example like the Tanith don't have a home world to go back to anyway. They are essentially kind of a marauding regiment, and their unit, their regiment, is kind of their home, wherever it is. They kind of set up shop wherever they are. They have, they marry each other in the regiment sometimes and have kids within the regiment. And so, their followers, their camp followers, their regiment followers follow them from world to world and kind of set up a, caravan camp behind them. And that's where, like, card games are played, where people drink socially, where the black market is set up and, like, transfuses into the local world at the time where they visit. And I would imagine most regiments are like this, where they are kind of their own little ecosystem and life of their own. And so, but many regiments do have a home world and a place to go back to if they aren't being deployed. And I imagine there's some level of retirement available for some of the soldiers. Some of the officers are pretty dang old and are in positions of power for a long time, especially at the very tops of the Astro Militarum itself. But I imagine, like, mid-level officers, a lot of them probably do get some sort of retirement eventually, since their effectiveness will eventually kind of wear them out over time, just through the, grueling grinder of war in Warhammer. All right, next we have question 15 here. Are there still diseases and plagues that could ravage a hive world? I imagine there is. What those are, we don't necessarily get a lot of knowledge on. If we are hearing about plagues in the Imperium, often those are some kind of plot by Nurgle, the literal plague god in the warp, that causes supernatural plagues to show up places and ravage the population. But there is some mentions here and there, places of like there's something called the Pale Wasting, which might be a type of disease that came out of the Ghoul Stars somewhere. But what exactly that is, we don't know. And as far as, like, diseases, I can't think of anything in a book that really was, like, some kind of plague in an area. I mean, you had, like, kind of, like, localized weird, like, skin issues sometimes amongst, like, menials that are working in, like, industrial places with no protection, that sort of thing. But I imagine that at times there are biological contagions that happen on different worlds, but it's just often probably, I would think that the medical care level on most worlds for the Imperium might be pretty decent, because it's not brought up very much, or it's just a missed lore bit that the authors normally don't really look into unless it's a chaos-inflicted disease plot, because other than that, we don't really hear much else about health within the Imperium. We don't really get to hear a lot about the day-to-day of anyone really in the Imperium that much. If there is illness, it's likely going to be amongst the lowest rungs of society, the menial workers, the people who are stuck in bad conditions, bad places to live, that sort of thing, which is kind of like a tale as old as time for that sort of thing. And then what is the state of medical technology involved with that? That's going to, again, vary widely from world to world and your class within society. There is sort of probably a middle class level of people, artisans and managers of factories, that sort of level, middle management type of person who can go see a doctor and get looked at for things. The Tanith First and Only have a few, doctors in their regiment that check up on the wellness of everybody and issue them medication and things like that as needed. And then at the very top of the pinnacle, you do have some pretty good technologies. You've got things that can basically rejuvenate lost flesh, very good augmetics that replace, like a lost eye or lost arm or leg, that are almost indistinguishable from the real thing. And but often those are kept for, like, inquisitors, aristocratic types at the top of the ladder, that sort of thing, like leadership roles that are very considered key, and positions of authority and power often hoard the best of the medical technology. Number 17, why is tech sacred? This goes all the way back to the Dark Age of technology. After the Dark Age happened and the uprisings from AI happened and ravaged the human empire at the time, the vestiges of that society, were picking up the pieces. And one of those that were picking up the pieces was the Adeptus Mechanicus of Mars. The Martian priesthood kind of rallied together and was able to kind of get a monopoly on existing tech at that point, and they were absolutely traumatized and terrified of AI and also of certain advanced technologies. So they outlawed certain technologies, and then since they were a religious order, they decided that existing tech was sacred, had spirits in it that they had to appease, that sort of thing. And they believe that kind of worshiping it in that way protects them and the machines from breaking down, from betraying humanity even, that sort of thing. So it's kind of a superstition and a sacredness at the same time. And then tumbling into 18, any advanced AI entities that remain active. Yes, I mean, there are a few, but they're often hidden or they have left the galaxy even. One Dark Age of Technology AI did leave the galaxy in a ship that we know of. One is located on the Speranza Arc Mechanicus. It is technically in control of that thing, which is, imagine a continent-sized vessel that has factories on board, things like that. It's absolutely massive, and it has a Dark Age of Tech AI at its heart. And then it's likely that Titans have some form of AI within them, and Titans are seen as so sacred and venerated by the Mechanicum that if it is AI and not a machine spirit, quote unquote, that is in Titans, that the Mechanicus would look away because they're not going to get rid of their Titans, both on religious grounds and just as a strategic asset, ground asset. Titans are a major bulwark against many enemies that the Imperium has and the Mechanicus has as well. Number 19, how easy is it to become corrupted by chaos? Hard and easy at the same time, I guess. It really depends on the knowledge you have within the universe, and most people do not have very good knowledge within the Imperium to really even delve into chaos. Now, that's not to say that you couldn't be recruited by a cult of chaos on your local world, and then from there become corrupted. If you know enough to know any of the words of chaos or like names of demons or anything like that, like on an Inquisitor level or Space Marine level or something like that, it becomes easier with the more knowledge of chaos to become corrupted by chaos. And that is why the Emperor tried to keep most of that knowledge secret during the Horus Heresy. Well, before that, during the Great Crusade, leading into the Horus Heresy, was because chaos is pernicious. You need knowledge to defeat it, but the knowledge of it can also be your undoing, unless you have like an inbuilt immunity to chaos like the Emperor seemed to have, or his Custodes. But the Emperor told people like, Malcador the Sigillite told people like Rogal Dorn, Primarch of the Imperial Fists, like, if we told you about chaos, you would have done, your research to try your best to fight it, but in doing so would have undone yourself, type of thing. So chaos is a promise of power with a lot of drawbacks, but a lot of people are willing to face those drawbacks to gain that power. Individuals like Erebus, Typhon, Karn even, who didn't exactly choose his path, but still fell to it. And he's very powerful now, but also damned to serve a specific god for all time and eternity. So chaos can also physically corrupt you only, not necessarily just mentally corrupt you. So it can, twist the bodies and the minds of worlds completely. The stuff of chaos, the stuff of the warp itself is usually very virulently dangerous to come in contact with physically, and can cause severe mutations. You have like the Soul Drinkers chapter of Space Marines who physically were corrupted by chaos, by Tzeentch specifically, known for as the Change God, and part of being the Change God is Tzeentch will bless its followers, or even non-followers, with new forms, and it did this to the whole Soul Drinkers chapter. Meanwhile, the Soul Drinkers themselves still worship the Emperor fiercely. They hated the Imperium, but they worshiped the Emperor still. So they had their minds still, and they did not like chaos. They still rooted out and fought chaos wherever they came across it. But then, the one time they did fight chaos in a really big way was they were fighting a Nurgle planet, and guess who probably set them up to go there? Tzeentch, because guess who Tzeentch hates? Nurgle. So, I mean, they can corrupt you without even you knowing you got corrupted by them, which is one of the reasons why the Imperium is so paranoid about chaos corruption, and why some Inquisitors, why it's kind of known notoriously that Inquisitors will sometimes wipe out an entire world if they find a single heretic on the world, because chances are that's just the surface of a very deep and nasty iceberg to try to root out from, you know, a high population world. There could be an entire chaos portal ready to just kick off there, and, you know, that Inquisitor might have witnessed before, like a gigantic demon portal that, you know, a demon prince came through and turned the entire planet into a giant world of tentacles with eyeballs on it. You know, like the Inquisitors have seen some nightmarish crap. They have seen a lot of nastiness, and so they go to a world, they hear chaos is there. I can imagine some of them being a bit quick on the trigger, so to speak, to purge that world of corruption. And that's why a lot of the individuals in the know in the Imperium are so ruthless, because they know that chaos can corrupt and spread without people even being aware that they are corrupted at times. And so that's what makes chaos powerful, is that just its influence can corrupt others and spread its influence, and it can just kind of chain react all the way down. And why, like, so many individuals are ready to just burn it with fire and be done with it, you know, burn it in the holy flames of the Emperor type of rhetoric, because it is as dangerous as they are, or more so, and they know it, basically. And our last one here is number 20. What is the lifespan of an Imperial citizen? This kind of goes back to, you know, like ranking and like role in society. The higher you are in the Imperium, the greater access to medical and biomechanical and biomedical technologies that you have. The highest levels of society have what's known as rejuvenant treatments that can keep them alive and well for several hundred years. Adeptus Mechanicus adepts replace most of their bodies with machine parts over the course of their lives, and so usually only their brain is like the remaining tissue left, and their entire body is some kind of machine agglomeration at that point. Sometimes bipedal, sometimes very much not so. Like, I think of one adept in the Speranza timeline books for the Gods of Mars series of books. One of the adepts there was basically some kind of spider arachnid type of body with its brain basically split up into multiple jars across the top of that body. So, and these adepts can last many hundreds of years, usually before usually dying, you know, in the course of their travels and study. They run afoul of another adept, or they, you know, they are fighting chaos or another enemy of the Empire and fail that way. There are a few that are much older, but often they're in more administrative type roles that keep them away from any kind of fighting or warfare. And so, like the Fabricator General of Mars, I don't really know how often they change out or why they would even have to. There's not really too much given on how a Fabricator General is picked for like the main leader of the Martian priesthood. But I mean, they're functionally probably nearly immortal, so I imagine internal politics eventually is what gets them, so to speak. But essentially, in general though, most Imperial citizens at the top of society are going to live probably around, I would guess, around 300 years at most. Probably maybe between 200 to 300 years old is the oldest you could get before any treatments are just going to fail you. But there are certainly a lot of individuals out there, especially Inquisitors, who are over 100 plus years old and still look probably like they're in their 30s or 40s, at most their 50s, and they're usually much older due to that technology available to them. So it's just worth keeping in mind that, you know, most individuals you see in the Imperium and you see in videos and things like that are probably older than what you think they are when you see them. Unless we know explicitly within the lore that from like a novel that we're seeing them in their younger years, which in some cases we do. But often case, a lot of the members we see live quite a bit longer. Now, at like the mid-level society, people probably live to between 50 to 80 years old, I would guess, depending on profession. Soldiers probably live into their 30s or 40s and often die. And then if they're in leadership roles, depending on how high up, probably depends on how much older you get, and eventually get to retire if you're like an officer level type of person. And we just hit over an hour, so that is really it for this list. Just wanted to run through some fun beginner lore facts that someone had up from a couple years back. Figure it's still relevant today, and also some of it was just fun to just talk about as if someone asked me these questions. Speaking of which, if you want to ask questions, just leave a comment. If you want to request a certain video type on a subject, let me know. I'd love to get some ideas from you. And if you're still here and you aren't subscribed, then I really would welcome you to subscribe. You obviously like it enough to be here still and haven't clicked off of this video yet. So please leave a like and a subscribe if you'd like to see more of this content. As always, I will see you in the next video. We are looking at doing live streaming of Space Marine 2 when it is out here shortly. So be looking for announcements on that as well. Hope you have a great day or night wherever you are, and I will see you in the next video. Have a great one.